For my genetics project, I have decided to talk about genetically modified organisms, in particular genetically modified foods. The history of genetically modified foods. Humans have been modifying our crops ever since the first civilization at Mesopotamia. However, it wasn't on the molecular level just yet. Farmers would find the traits that they wanted most in their crops, like height or more bulbs, to produce more food. Then they would only use seeds that would have these traits. This is not unlike Mendel and his pea plants, where he pollinated the plants to get the traits he wanted. Then in 1944, scientists discovered that genetic material can be transferred between different species. And in 1973, DNA recombination technology was developed. That showed that And in 1973, a DNA recombination technology was developed that showed a genetically engineered DNA could be transferred throughout different species. This allowed for scientists to put traits from different species into another and genetically modify them. In 1983, the first genetically modified plants were produced. They were antibiotic-resistant tobacco plants and petunias. These genetically modified plants were not made available to the public. They are for scientific purposes only. That all changed in 1994 when the first genetically modified tomato was sold in grocery stores all across the US. This tomato was genetically modified to have a delayed ripening process so that they would last longer on the shelves. Today there are over 140 genetically modified foods that have been permitted to be sold in Canada, but GM foods is the most controversial topic in the modern agricultural industry. How genetically modifying food works. There are a few ways to genetically modify foods, but I will only be outlining the most common way of doing so. So, DNA of the desired effect is coated on microparticles, which are then shot at high velocities into the target tissues, generally embryonic tissues in the seeds. This is the most effective way to transfer multiple large DNA fragments together, and sometimes it can even transfer full chromosomes. What are the benefits to using GM foods? One of the benefits is insect resistance. Basically, when an insect goes to munch on a plant for a little snack, there will be a GM gene that will kill them. Another way of getting rid of pests is to make the plant pesticide resistant, so the farmer can use harsher pesticides to get rid of more weeds knowing that they aren't going to harm their crops. Another benefit to GM crops is that they can create a longer shelf life for the food. This increases profit and decreases wasted food. Genetically modifying crops also allows for a better yield from the crops, as scientists can add all of the desirable traits like height or more bulbs and seeds on any given plant. From 1996 to 2012, there was an increase of 370 million tons of food crops. 1/7 of that is from GM crops in the US. If the GM crops had not been available, the US would have had to use 32% more land to get the same yield. By genetically modifying crops, scientists can make them more likely to survive in harsh weather conditions. This may not seem like much, but with climate change, we are at risk of losing crops that cannot handle changing weather patterns and harsher climates. Scientists are working on genetically modifying foods so they can add vaccines into the foods to help developing countries get vaccinated. I do not have this listed on the slides as it is going to take a while before we see this come to pass, and it will most likely be very controversial. As many positives as there are with genetically modified foods, there are also issues to counter them. There are many religious and cultural groups from across the world that are against GM foods because they aren't natural. For example, the Indigenous peoples of Canada believe that everything Mother Nature gives them is sacred, including food. So by tampering with the genetic makeup of the food, we are going against their religion and beliefs. Another issue is that people think GM foods are toxic. A common argument for this is that if an insect eats it and they'll die, then I'll die if I eat too much of it. That statement sounds convincing until we look at certain foods we eat. Humans can eat chocolate, but it is toxic to dogs. We drink coffee, but just a little bit of it kills insects. It is genes like these that are added to GM foods to kill the insects and not necessarily poisons. One argument that doesn't have a counter argument from the scientific community is that the nature will find a way to combat the genetically modified foods. The GM foods become resistant to insects and pesticides for now. But what do we do? But what about in a few years? If there's one thing we know about Mother Nature, it is that she always finds a way to adapt and overcome any challenge placed before her. How else would we have bounced back after multiple ice ages? Another concern with GM foods is that organisms will develop a resistance to antibiotics. Antibiotics are used in genetic modification to see if the modification was successful. Then, by eating these GM foods, there is a chance that someone could develop a resistance to antibiotics. GM foods and allergies. For this project, I wanted to see if genetically modified food had anything to do with allergies. In particular, I wanted to find out if my theory, albeit one with little to no proof, was true. My theory is that GM foods cause allergies. Not allergies as a whole, but right around the time when GM foods were introduced, children with allergies in the US quintupled. Other than what I just told you, there's no further evidence of this theory. Despite not getting any answers about where my allergies came from, I learned how scientists try and avoid allergies in GM food. When creating genetically modified foods, scientists avoid the big 8 common allergenic foods, which are milk, eggs, nuts, wheat, legumes, fish, molluscles, and crustaceans. There is one case of a genetically modified soybean that was synthesized with Brazil nuts, and people with an allergy to Brazil nuts and not to soybeans had an allergic reaction. Because of this, the developers behind this never tried to commercialize their soybeans. Another interesting discovery I made was that GM foods can have a higher concentration of allergenic proteins. When a plant is undergoing stress, they can have a higher concentration of these proteins. This could be the difference of an upset stomach to anaphylactic shock in some people. If if getting foreign DNA shot into a plant's embryonic tissue doesn't cause them stress, then I don't know what will. Overall, the GM industry is very cautious when it comes to food allergies. In conclusion, GM foods are very controversial, but there are a lot of positives and negatives regarding the technology, so the future of it is unknown. But with this genetic technology, there are infinite possibilities.